Hello lovely people, welcome to my autumn reading wrap-up.
Sophie vlogs.
I usually post book chats every week, which are roundups of stuff I have read at some vague point in the past, but in autumn I was overwhelmed with certain reading, I don't even know the words, I had some yearnings and I needed to fulfill them. So this is responding to the autumn TBR, which I posted about October time. And I'm just going to go through and talk about the books that I did read and the books that I didn't manage to read yet. An honourable mention right when I kick off is I should say that I have not read The Name of the Wind, despite it being one of the books in my TBR that I was like, this is a priority read. I really want to read this, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to try and do it in December. When my end of year wrap up comes, I'll be honest about whether or not I achieved that. That said, I'm going to kick off with the two books that I no longer have with me to show you, starting with Pet Sematary by Stephen King. This was lent to me by my co-worker who is a massive Stephen King fan. The only other Stephen King I've previously read is Carrie, which I really enjoyed, and then I tried to read It when I was much too young, and I didn't get on with it because it was very scary for, like, a child. Pet Sematary I actually really enjoy. His family moves into this house because the guy has a new job, and the guy opposite the road, this old guy, takes them up and shows them this place called the Pet Cemetery, where loads of kids in the town have always buried their pets. Because it is a Stephen King, there is not quite as simple as that. There is more to this, and some creepy things happen. The thing I think I liked most about Pet Sematary, actually, the thing I liked most about Pet Sematary is it's got one of the best epilogues I've ever read. I thought it was just a fantastic end to a book. The other thing that I really liked is I liked how much it built up suspense and tension. That's jogging those together. It actually takes a while to get to the real supernaturally meat of the book, the climax, if you will, but the whole thing is constantly building, not necessarily always foreshadowing, but giving you little tidbits of information that mean you're slowly starting to piece together a theory about what's going to happen at the end of this book. And by the time the events come, it's almost like a relief that they're actually happening, because you've built up so much expectation and tension about, like, how is this all going to end for this family, that, like, when all the stuff is happening, comparatively, the actual, like, the climactic events do not take that long to play out, but you, especially when you're getting towards that end, you're, like, switching between perspectives, and I just felt like it built up such tension. And I read it in October, just before Halloween, and I felt like it was a really great Halloween-y read, and so I actually really enjoyed Pet Sematary. If anyone watching this has read lots of Stephen King, I would be interested in recommendations of where to go next, because I know that some of his stuff can be quite different, so I'm not entirely sure. Bearing in mind I've enjoyed Carrie and Pet Sematary, I'm not super interested in rereading It, because I would like to give that much more time, and it's quite chunky. So, like, is there a third book that is good to go next? Where do I go? Do tell me. The next book is a completely different genre, and it's How Not to Be a Boy by Robert Webb. Brain blank for a hot minute there. This is Robert Webb's part memoir about his life and growing up, but then also part looking at sort of our attitudes towards masculinity and the ways in which that can be very trapping, and quite honestly the ways in which throughout his life he has fallen into those traps, and how it has, like, in many ways stunted him and stopped him from being able to develop, like, as much as he would have liked to, and stuff like that. To be honest with you, I was concerned that it was going to be two separate threads and that the book wasn't going to come together as a whole, but actually I thought because he has all this personal experience, it's sort of like he's telling you about his life and you're learning about his life, which I didn't know anything about him, to be honest, other than that he's in the Mitchell & Webb book. That was, like, the extent of my knowledge. But actually he is telling you more about himself, and then these lessons about the types of messages which we give to boys and stuff like that, and how harmful that can be, it's stuff he's lived through. So he's not just being like, here's some stuff about me, here's some stuff about gender, here's some stuff about me. It's like so interwoven with like, oh, also like here are these concepts, and also like this is how this played into this situation in my life, and I kind of wish I had been shown a different method of dealing with, like, for example, grief because he lost his mother quite young, how he wasn't really processing that grief in ways which maybe were detrimental to him and stuff, and like the ways in which he treated relationships and all this stuff. Like, I thought it was very interestingly done. I quite enjoyed it, actually. I thought it was good. After that, I went into some middle grade fiction, and I read The Secret Dragon by Ed Clarke. I mentioned that I wanted to read some dragon books. This one seemed like the most dragony of all my little middle grade suggestions, so I went for it. This is essentially about Mari Jones, who lives in Wales. She wants to be a fossil hunter because that's what her dad, who died when she was young, was really interested in, and he's really fostered that love in her. But unfortunately, because her dad passed away, it's now just her and her mum, is just trying to run the farm, and she wishes that Mari was more involved with like the animals and stuff like that. But all Mari wants to do is go fossil hunting on the beaches and that sort of thing. But one day, while she's fossil hunting on the beaches, she finds a dragon, and then she has to definitely become more involved with animals then. This was a perfectly fun little middle grade read. I really liked the thread of like fossil hunting, and also like it's giving like little informations about like women who were really vital in fossil hunting when it was like first like exploding as a thing that people did and that sort of thing, which I thought was a really nice detail. This sort of has a nice little like friendship in it, a nice message about like family and how you treat your family and that sort of thing. On the whole, it's quite a lovely little read, and I would definitely recommend it if you have kids who are sort of middle grade range who are interested in dragons. It's not the most like fantastical book. It's very much like based in like reality, but then like there's a dragon, so it's a little bit more like the practical side of what would happen if a dragon suddenly appeared and you're a child and you have to look after it, rather than like a fantasy adventure. But if that sounds like something that you might be interested in, I would definitely recommend it. Changing tack once more, I then read The Count of Monte Cristo on my Kindle because there's no way. Essentially, I went to Paris in October, I had a great time, and when I go to places, I like to read something that is in some way linked to that place. So my main thing was I wanted to read something French. And I just became overwhelmed with this urge to read The Count of Monte Cristo, despite the fact that it's like 1,200 pages long. I was just like, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. So I read it on my Kindle so I wouldn't have to lug a gigantic book on the Eurostar with me. And I'll tell you what, I had a cracking time. We visited the tomb of Alexandre Dumas when we were in Paris. We went to the Pantheon and he's buried there. And I gave him like a little thing and I was like, babe, you know how to write an adventure book. Because The Count of Monte Cristo is essentially, it's about this guy who, everything is going right for him. He's about to get like this, he's a sailor, he's about to get like this promotion from the ship, he's engaged to the woman he loves, he's going to look after his father, and then through some machinations of people who are not very nice, he gets wrongfully imprisoned for something that he hasn't really done. And then, like, so much happens in this book. It's like, he's in prison for years, there's like a prison break, there's buried treasure, there's like all of these workings of his revenge. And one thing that I found really interesting is it's like, as well as being just like action, there was this whole thing about like, he views himself as when he's sort of, when he breaks out of prison. That's not really a spoiler because obviously he can't spend the whole book in prison, it's a very long book. But when he breaks out, he's like rewards the people who were loyal to him and sort of like wreaks vengeance on the people who weren't. And he like views himself as being like a righteous, like what he's doing is like approved by God, he is being righteous. And there's sort of like this discussion of like, is he? What of his actions are entirely justified? What of his actions are not justified? And then one thing that I did also like about this is that when he is like plotting these things, he's like weaving a web. There's like multiple identities involved about like who he is pretending to be at various points and stuff. And again, there is this tension that builds up because you can pick up on threads of what he's doing, but you don't really know what his end game fully is. And to be honest with you, I was really surprised by how much I enjoyed this book. I thought it was like adventure after adventure after adventure, and I would definitely be interested in reading stuff like The Three Musketeers now that I've read this, because there's always that fear with like classics and stuff that they're not going to be like accessible and you might be a bit hard going, but actually like this was cracking. I had a great time. After that I read the other books that I said I definitely wanted to do, and I actually did it. The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. This is about this guy. I feel like all of my introductions to books are like, there's this guy, but there is this guy, and he's just like walking in London one day, and then this woman in white approaches him, and he essentially like helps her get to where she needs to be and keeps it stum, and then he goes to be a drawing teacher to these two women in the countryside, and then like essentially this woman's tale is somehow linked to these women's tale, and danger and intrigue follow. This is really classic, like, Victorian Gothic mystery stuff. On the whole, I really enjoyed this. I do think that Wilkie Collins could have made it a bit shorter. Could have cut some of the waffle. After a while, especially when you're coming towards the end, there was just quite a lot where I was like, okay, I get that we're being really, really thorough, but also could we, like, stunk it along a bit? Because you sometimes take out some of the oomph of your final points if you just take a very long time to get there. One thing I loved about this is Marion, one of the women who he teaches drawing to. Essentially, like, our main guy falls in love with one of the sisters, Marion's the other sister, they become like BFFs, but also Marion is bloody great. Essentially, there's like two guys in here who are like villains. One of them is so obviously villainy, and then the other one is so like, he's such a great villain, because you think that this other guy is going to be your main adversary, but then as things are going on, you're starting to realise that he is, like, definitely a terrible person, but this other guy is, like, the brains, and he's just, like, formidable as a foe. And what I liked about Marion is that Marion is so, like, when it comes to looking after her sister, she is so fearless. She really, she uses all of her wits. She is not afraid to, like, put herself in, like, slightly dangerous situations to, like, find out some stuff. One thing I was sad about is the form of this changes. So it starts off with, like, Walter's narration, and then when Walter leaves that situation, Marion's diary takes over because Marion is there. And so the whole narration is pieced together from, like, oh, like, we took a statement from this person who can tell us about this bit which none of our main characters were there for, and that sort of thing. So you're piecing together different people's narration. I was just sad that Marion's narration, we didn't get more narration from her, especially towards the end. I would have loved to have just, like, continued having Marion be our viewpoint, because she's just brilliant and I love her. And also there was a fair bit of, like, women supporting women in this, which I really liked, because, you know, one thing I did find funny is as soon as Walter first sees Marion, she's, like, looking out the window and he's like, oh, what a noble bearing. And then she turned around and he was like, she is so ugly. And I was like, Walter, have you no chill? Also, she's amazing, so shut up. Changing tack again, after that I read Max Kowalski Didn't Mean It by Susie Day. This is a book that promised me dragons, and to be honest with you, I would have liked a little bit more dragons and magic. What this actually is Max Kowalski, I think he's about 8 years old, his dad gets involved in some slightly dodgy things and he has to disappear for a while, and so Max is left in charge of his sisters, and he doesn't know what to do. They don't know when his dad's coming back. So he decides he's going to go and take them over to Wales, where his friend grandmother has a little house, and then they're just going to, like, deal with it. So what this really is it's not a book about dragons. It's a book about family. It's a book about how to deal with these tricky situations and what to do if your parent isn't stepping up like they should be and looking after you and that sort of thing, which just has, like, a little bit of rumoured dragons at the edges. I did enjoy this. I thought it was a perfectly lovely book. I didn't think it was as special as I had hoped it to be, and I don't want that to be really damning. It's just the back said, oh, and there are dragons, and I wanted a bit more magic and dragons. But that's just what I was promised versus what I was given. Okay, I've got two final things to talk about and then we're done. So, next up is The October Man by Ben Aaronovitch. This is like a short story set in the Rivers of London world. Normally Rivers of London follows Peter Grant, who is, like, in London working for, like, essentially the magic side of the police force. This one actually is set in Germany, and it follows a new character called Tobias. One thing I enjoyed about this is getting a look at the German side, because the backstory of this series is essentially, like, there are so much less magic users than there used to be, because in World War II, but magic users of the Allied forces then versus like the German forces, they had like a big showdown and loads of people died and stuff. So with that context, it was very interesting to get a look at what the contemporary German magic forces are like, and then compare that to how the London magic forces are functioning in our main book series. This, as always with this series, was fun. There's like, each book has like different themes and stuff that we're sort of exploring. So this one was sort of exploring like winemaking, which is interesting because I don't know a lot about winemaking. My critique of this would be that Tobias as a narrator was nigh on indistinguishable from Peter as a narrator. They are like, if you ignore the fact that they've got different backstories with their families, same narration style, couldn't really have told the difference if you'd have just given me two passages of them. So, like, that was a critique in some ways, because I was just like, well, it's the same tone, it's the same voice. Also, I'm not entirely sure who the intended audience for this is, because there's a lot of explaining the magic background, which we already know because we have read the main series. So occasionally that was also a little bit, I was like, I do know this because I've read 7 of the books. But as a short story, I really enjoyed it. I always really enjoy this series. It's quite a lot of fun, and I'm going to be interested to see if these figures who are introduced here are about to be weaved into our main plot line, and if that's why we're doing this, and in that case, how so? Intrigue. Finally, I read a collection of short stories, and that's Ovid Metamorphosed, edited by Philip Terry. These are short stories, all inspired by Ovid's Metamorphoses. On the whole, I did what I do with most short story collections, and I gave this 3 stars because that's generally where these things average out to me. However, 3 stories were particular highlights, and so I thought I would just talk about those. Starting with Narcissus and Echo by Nicole Ward Juve. I really enjoyed how the original Narcissus and Echo myth was weaved into this, because sort of our narrator is called Heloise, and Heloise is at this like conference thing for this writer called Miranda, and Miranda is very much our Narcissus figure, but in this situation it's like this idea of her as a writer holds these meetup things, which are all of her like really dedicated fans, because she needs to see their view of her reflected back to her, and there's this whole thing about her as a writer and stuff needing this approval and this like validation from the people who read her, which was just like a really interesting way of interpreting it. And then the Echo figure in this, I wasn't entirely sure which of the side figures was going to become the Echo figure, but the way that was weaved in I also really enjoyed. And essentially, like, there were lots of little things which were like nods to the original myth, but I felt like this was one of the ones that interpreted it in a way that I actually found really connected to, because a lot of these actually, when I was reading them, especially some towards the first half of this, they really highlighted essentially the misogyny of the originals, but when you situate these things in a modern context, some of that misogyny is so much more glaring, because it's just like, oh god, we do not act like this, no. So some of them were harder to connect to for that reason, and that's not necessarily a criticism, because it is present in the original. So like, if you're adapting it and you maintain that misogyny, it's not necessarily like you've done a bad adaptation, because it was already there, it's just not as fun to read. The other one I really liked was Arachne by A.S. Byatt, and it was almost like, instead of being a short story, it was sort of like an essay, because we started off, there were like 3 different font styles, and each font style is like a different narrative thread, and they all get like woven together to make the whole. I'm using weaving metaphors because it's about Arachne, and also I'm reading The Golden Thread at the moment, so everything's about fabric. But it sort of like becomes this discussion on both Arachne as a figure and the myth, and maybe Arachne wasn't punished, maybe Arachne was turned into a spider for vengeance because she was as good as Athena, who knows. But then it also like talks about spiders, and like both spiders in like a scientific context and also like in literature, what are interpretations of spiders? And it was just sort of became this like essay on the whole thing, and I found it really interesting. And then the final one was Eurydice's Answer by Suniti Namjoshi, which is literally that long, but really powerful, and it's about like, why did you look back? And it was too pages, barely 2 pages, but I just found it just, oh, like the final few lines, I was just like, oh, I'm gonna have to sit with this and ponder it for a while. But yes, that's everything I wanted to talk about. These are the main books off of that TBR that I have read. I have also been doing Non-Fiction November reading, and there will be a Non-Fiction November roundup very soon. But as per usual, have you read any of these? I'd love to hear your thoughts. It's interesting to see what I was able to get to. I wasn't able to read everything I wanted to because I had actual reading commitments for stuff, which I'll be talking about in a book chat instead of this. But I'm happy with what I managed to get to. I will be reading The Name of the Wind very soon. Did you read anything particularly in autumn because you felt like you needed to because it was autumn? Did you have anything tying into that? Do let me know. Otherwise, I hope you're having a lovely day, and I will see you next time for something different.